Morning, everybody. How's it going? I'm excited about this disco. I heard Josh was going to be wearing a leisure suit and some bell bottoms, and he's going to be looking fly. My name is Aaron. I'm one of the guys on the team here. I get the privilege of leading our Next Gen ministry, which means our kids and students that are stomping around up there, which are awesome, and to get to throw parties like disco parties and all that. So we have an incredible team that's pouring into your kids and students every week, and I hope you appreciate them and what they do as they love on your kids. And I get the privilege of doing that, yeah. So I also get the privilege of speaking on Labor Day when generally no one shows up, but you guys like, what's up, everybody? Hey. And if you're watching online, we're glad you're tuned in as well. We're actually wrapping up this series, Guardrails, that we've been going through over the last 5 weeks. And we've talked about this a lot, about how guardrails are the system that are designed to keep a vehicle from straying into a dangerous or an off-limit area, and that these guardrails aren't something that we honestly think about a whole lot, really. We don't sit around thinking about guardrails. But when we need them, they're there, right? And we want them to be there, and they're designed to direct and to protect us. They're always placed in the safety zone, not in the danger zone. If they were in the danger zone, then we'd be out of luck by the time we hit a guardrail, right? So they're preventative measures that we take in order to keep from getting off track. And the point of a guardrail, personally, is to create the standard of behavior in our lives that becomes a matter of conscience. So when we see something that's kind of out of place, it kind of dings our conscience, it lights up our conscience to say, hey, something's not quite right, and I probably need to take a corrective measure in my life. And today we're going to be talking about actually what I think is probably the most important guardrail of all, and I'll clarify why I think it's the most important. In the Old Testament, there was this guy named Solomon, and I don't know if you're familiar with Solomon, but Solomon was actually the son of David, and David was known as a man after God's own heart. So imagine your father being a man after God's own heart. You're probably going to have a pretty good upbringing, right? And Solomon grew up to be a really good dude, and actually he had this encounter with God, and God actually told him, like, hey, if you could have anything you want, what would you want? And he said he would want wisdom, and God was very pleased with that answer. So it says that God gave him wisdom, and he actually became the wisest man that ever lived. So when a wise person that ever lives speaks up and writes some books in the Bible, we want to pay attention, especially when they call to attention one specific thing that they place of a high priority. And so that's what we find in the book of Proverbs, chapter 4, verse 23. It says this. It says, above all else. So we want to listen up, right? Above all else. This wise man's telling us there's something that's more important than anything else he wrote about. And he wrote about a lot of things. He wrote about money. He wrote about relationships. He wrote about the meaning of life. And he says, hey, above all else, this right here, guard your heart. Guard your heart. What's in here is really, really important. And you need to take care of it above all else. And he says, for everything you do flows from it. Not some things you do, not a little bit of what happens to your life, not part of the direction or the course of your life takes. Like everything you do flows from this one thing. You need to guard your heart. There is a guardrail there that we need to protect our hearts. And today that's what I want to talk about is how we do that, because over time in our lives, I think what happens is slowly things seep into our hearts, and sometimes we don't even know those things are in there till they come out, and then it's too late, right? We're in the danger zone. I remember when I was in college, I worked at a movie theater. Anybody ever work at a movie theater? It is the funnest job I ever had. It was awesome. Except for this movie theater that I worked at was just being built. And I don't know if you've ever been or worked in a place where they just built the building, but if you have, do you know what happens when it rains in a new building? You discover all the things where it leaks, right? Where things start to seep into this building. You start to discover that maybe they didn't have things sealed up the way that they thought they were sealed up. And I remember specifically, this movie theater had only been open a couple weeks, and the movie Castaway had just come out. Do you guys remember this movie with Tom Hanks, and he's talking to Wilson, the ball, and all that? And so the movie's got a lot of water in the movie. Like there's water noise the whole time. And we knew this theater leaked, but we didn't know how bad it leaked. And I remember it was crazy because like it was just a torrential downpour that night, and the water actually started like seeping into this movie theater, and we didn't really realize how much, and you probably won't even believe me. I don't even believe this happened if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, but water started creeping up in this theater. And because there was so much ambiance of like water and noise and things like this, the people that were in the theater didn't even know that the theater was filling up with water. They didn't realize till they walked out of the theater and literally people had like watermarks up to their knees. And they realize, and they come out of this theater and they're like, what in the world? Like, where did this water come from? Like, where did this come from? And we walked in the theater after it was over. We turned on the lights. The subwoofers were like floating up in the front. Like, this theater was like totally flooded. And only like one person came out and even noticed, because it slowly seeped up and they were surrounded by all these things. And they were like, where in the world did this come from? And that's kind of a really good picture, I think, of what happens in our hearts. Things slowly seep in, and then all of a sudden something comes out, and you're like, where in the world did that come from? Well, it came from your heart, right? And if you see, from an early age, we learn to monitor and modify our behavior. Like there's things that we do, like, when you're a kid, you learn not to hit your sister or your brother. You're going to get grounded. Like I learned when I was 8 not to throw a dodgeball at a hornet's nest. That's a bad idea. Like you learn things and you start to behave in certain ways because you learn things and you modify your behavior, and you learn the right things to say to get the job, or the right things to say to impress the girl you like. And you're in this stage of development in much of the early years of your life. In fact, up into your early 20s, your brains are still developing. Like you're learning to modify and monitor your behavior. And this is great for you, if anybody has teenagers in the room. Like this is like how you get by the teenage years, I think, is just to understand that your kids' brains aren't fully developed yet. And every time they do something dumb, you're like, it's okay. Their brain's not fully formed. Like that's the only way you can like really get through that, I think. But we do, and we learn this process of like monitoring and modifying our behavior. But we often neglect, as we don't learn to monitor and modify what's going on in our hearts. And there's a big difference, and like Solomon says, everything we do flows out from that thing. So what does this look like? How do we pay attention to the state of our hearts? Well, the Bible has a lot to say about it, and I want to kind of camp out in one particular story about Jesus and then look at another verse later on. So if you want to open up to Matthew chapter 15, we're going to be looking at this story where Jesus has this encounter with the Pharisees and a crowd. This was a common occurrence, and it starts out this way, and I'm just going to kind of talk about it as we go through. It says, then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jerusalem and asked. And this was a common thing. Like all the time Jesus teach, there was crowds and people came up, and this was the time when the Pharisees used to hone in on Jesus because they wanted to divide the crowd. They wanted to separate him from the crowd. They wanted to create division between him and the crowd because they wanted to get him away and hurt him and harm him. And so they would often come up with these trick questions to come and to say them to Jesus in order to kind of dupe him and make him look foolish in front of the crowd. But often that totally, every time pretty much, they flipped that on their head and they walked away looking like they were a foolish one. And this is no exception. He comes to him and he says this. They say, why do your disciples break the traditions of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat. So this is the question they pose. Like, why aren't you guys washing your hands before you eat? And that may sound like a weird question, but there was this ceremony, this like custom, this tradition that priests had to do these certain duties where they had to wash their hands. So if they touched something that was unclean, they had to make themselves clean before they could do their ceremonial duties. And so for the priests, this is what they were supposed to do. But this was a tradition. It wasn't like a law. They just did it to prevent themselves from breaking the law and becoming unclean. And over time, they actually elevated this law to everybody in the Jewish community to try to make them have to do the same things in order so they wouldn't break a law. And so they kind of, if I could kind of put this in today's terms, like you ever go to McDonald's and you see that picture in the bathroom or that sign in the wall, it's like, hey, employees must wash their hands before returning to work. You seen that sign, right? So imagine if you're at McDonald's and you're hanging out with your friends and you're all doing it, and the manager comes up to you when you're with your friends and he's like, hey you, I saw you in there. You went in the bathroom and you didn't wash your hands. And you're like, I'm not an employee, right? Like, it's still gross. You should wash your hands. But, like, that rule's not applicable to you. In fact, it wasn't even a rule. It was a tradition. And so they're saying this to Jesus. And here's what Jesus says back. He says, tradition, like, he says, why do you actually break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? So he kind of turns it on them. He's like, you're saying I'm breaking a tradition. You're actually breaking a command of God. And he says this. He says, for God said, honor your mother and father, but you say that anyone declares what might have been used to help their father or mother is devoted to God. They are not to honor their father or mother with it. And basically what he's saying is they had actually taken another law and created another law because they were all about creating laws. trying to make everything perfect with God. And so they created this law that said, basically, if a person wants to, they can say, I hereby dedicate everything I own, all my possessions, to the temple. And by doing this, they would say, basically, everything I own is now the church's. But in the meantime, while I'm alive, I can use that thing for me and my immediate family. But when I die, whatever's left over goes. And so people started doing this and saying that, but they started doing it as an excuse to not have to give things to other people in need. And especially, there was actually some of these leaders that were doing this to their parents. He's saying, hey, the law says honor your mother and father, but you've created this other law that says I don't have to give them and help them out when they're old and they need to be moved into a nursing home. Like I don't have to give that to them because I've already dedicated it all to the temple. Like it's all going over there. And so these people were actually sidestepping the real law because of these other laws they had made to prevent the law. You follow me? It's like when you have a teenager, I'm picking on the teenagers today, but like they're being mouthy, you know, and you're like, hey, don't talk to your mom or your father that way. And they're like, fine, well, I'm just not going to talk to them at all, right? So they made their own rule that breaks the initial rule because it's still disrespectful, right? And so this is essentially what we find in this story. And so Jesus calls them out on it. He says, hey, you said I'm breaking a tradition. You're actually breaking the law. And he called them out and he said, this. He said, Isaiah was right when you prophesied about you. He said, thus you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition, you hypocrites. Now, when Jesus in the scriptures said you hypocrites, that was kind of the end of the conversation. That was like the mic drop moment, like, hey, we're done. I'm done with you. And then he goes on and he says, hey, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain, and their teachings are merely human rules. He basically calls them out, and he's like, hey, you guys need to check your hearts. Like, your words don't mean anything if your actions and your speech lines up, and if you're creating these other systems to kind of bypass this, like your teachings are in vain. And then Jesus called the crowd to him separately after that, and he says, hey, I'm going to teach you something else. He says, listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth is what defiles them. And here's the thing to understand is like in this culture, this was like a huge statement that Jesus was unleashing on them. Jesus was this hinge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. He came to establish a new covenant that would be for all people, not just God's chosen people. And he's saying, and in that culture and still in the Jewish culture today, like there's certain things you just don't eat. And he's saying, hey, it's not about what you put in your mouth that makes you unclean. It's about what comes out of you that makes you unclean. And this was a big shift because before it was all about making God happy. And he's actually saying, hey, what comes out of you actually hurts other people. And that displeases God. And then the disciples, it says, come to him, and they said, do you know that the Pharisees were offended by this? Like, Jesus, do you know who just made them mad? And really what he's saying is like, hey, like, are you sure about this? Like, this is a big shift for us. Like, are you sure that what they're saying is not right? Like, can you imagine having years and years of tradition of saying you don't eat that, you don't eat that, you don't eat that? And he's like, oh, no, it's not. That's not what's important. Like this was a big change. And then Peter actually takes it a step further in a couple verses later, and he says, hey, explain this parable to us. And Peter gets a bad rap because he comes up with these really dumb questions, but really he's just the one that's bold enough to say it. Have you ever been in a meeting where like everyone's thinking something but no one's willing to say it, and then there's that one guy that will speak up and say it, and then they just get hammered? Like that's Peter. And so Peter says, he's like, hey, explain that to us. Because it's just a really hard teaching, this understanding that like what we eat's not really going to determine what pleases God. Can you explain this again? And I love this story because I think it's so funny, because I think this is like Jesus is just humorous. And he replies, he says, Peter, are you so dull? Peter, are you so dull? In fact, one translation says, Peter, do you still not understand? Like, do you not get it? I think he probably started talking a little slower. Like, Peter, do you need me to explain this to you? Or like, have you seen Rush Hour and like Chris Tucker to Jackie Chan? He's like, do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? Like I think he's like, you know, like Peter, let me explain this slowly for you. What comes into your mouth goes into your stomach, and then it comes out. Yeah, that's digestion 101, Peter. And Peter's like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Like he's like, that's not what the thing. He says, but the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these are what defile them. Not Not what goes in, what comes out, the words that we say, the things that we do that wreak havoc on other people, because these lead to other things. He says, for out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are the behaviors that are displeasing to God. Not just the kind of meat you eat, like the things that you say to other people that are harmful. These are what defile a person. Mistreating other people. God is way more concerned about our hearts than what's in our diet. Right? He's more concerned, not that we didn't wash our hands at McDonald's, but more concerned when we railed the cashier because she got her order wrong and demean them and treat them poorly. Like, that's what he's concerned about. These are what defile a person, but eating with unwashed hands does not defile them. So if the things that come out of our mouth are what are displeasing to God, and these are the things that harm people, and these things are initially sourced in our hearts, right, we really need to guard our hearts. Because what comes in on the inside will eventually manifest its way on the outside, and we don't want to be in that situation where we're like, where did that come from? Because our behavior will eventually mirror our hearts. Our behavior will eventually mirror our hearts. And I think we've all seen this at some point, and I think in our day and age, a lot of times we call it a midlife crisis. Like, people have all these things, and we see people, and they wreck everything in their life, like their marriage or their career or their finances, because something on the inside got loose, and really what that is probably 20 or 30 years of just holding something in, and then it finally makes its way out, and it wreaks havoc on their lives. And so today, I want to talk about 4 things that I think we need to kind of be paying attention to, things that should ding our conscience, and an alarm should signal in our heads. It's like, hey, something is not right when we see these things showing up in our life. And these are going to be kind of our 4 guardrails for guarding our heart, and they are guilt, anger, greed, and jealousy. Guilt, anger, greed, and jealousy. I'm going to start with guilt. Guilt is this feeling that, like, I owe you. Like, I did something really bad. I feel really guilty about it, and I owe you. I've got to do something about it. Sometimes maybe that person doesn't know. Maybe sometimes they do, but it's just been left unresolved. And guilt leads to all kinds of crazy things, because when we've hurt someone and our life went off this guardrail and we just have left the shrapnel everywhere. It leads to us putting up walls. It leads us to not letting people in because we're afraid that maybe they'll find out the real us, the things that we did, and that if people found out the real things that we had done and the guilt that we have, like that they wouldn't look at us the same way anymore. It leads us to be inauthentic, to pretend to sometimes be someone we're not, to try to create this better version of ourselves instead of correcting the version that we really are. It leads us to be dishonest, to lie and to try to protect our image to the ones we love. It leads to secret keeping, to holding things in, to hiding it away and just hoping that no one ever finds out what we've really done. Or it leads to us distancing people and just not letting people close to us at all and just always holding everyone at an arm's length and saying, you know what, I'm just not going to build relationships with anybody anymore because I have this guilt and I don't want them to know about the things that I've done or that have been done to me. And this guilt seeps into our words and our behaviors, and it wrecks our relationships with this feeling of I owe you. The next one is anger. You owe me. You hurt me. You took something from me. I'm going to have to pay you back for what you've been done, or pay me back or else. And I think perhaps anger is probably the most difficult one for us to identify because it's never isolated to its origin source, like its original source. It always, and I think you probably encountered this, right? A lot of times what triggers people to be angry isn't really what they're angry about, right? It's probably something way far in their past that's just like still in their heart and it's still there, and they don't even always identify it. Like it's something from their childhood or someone that hurt them in the past, but something triggers that, and then that anger is brought back out. And then it's also not directed to its intended source either, right? Because they're probably angry about somebody else over here, but you take the brunt of it. Right? It's never isolated to its original source. It's just kind of spread all throughout our lives. And that's what makes anger so dangerous, is identifying the source can be so tricky, and it just spills into every area of our life. The next one is greed. I owe me. Greed is this assumption that everything is for our consumption. It turns our backs to people, and it becomes a filter for decisions. And what happens is we start to actually have people in our lives competing for the stuff in our lives. And possessions can sometimes then start to be more important than people to us. And when you get to that place, that's a dangerous place. I don't know if you think, I was thinking about this in like The Sandlot when he takes his dad's Babe Ruth baseball, right? That possession. And he does so many things because he really thinks and believes in that movie probably that his dad cares more about that baseball than he does him. Right? We see it on Black Friday, right? People don't care about people on Black Friday. They care about possessions, right? And they trample other people, and greed causes us to do all kinds of crazy things. Last one is jealousy. Life owes me. Jealousy is this feeling that like you're entitled or you're owed something, or maybe by somebody or maybe even by God. Somebody got what you deserve. They got the guy or the girl that you wanted. They got the dream house. They got the new car you wanted. They got the promotion that you were supposed to get. They got the corner office with the big gold nameplate on it, right? And you see these things and you think to yourself like, hey, I was supposed to get that. I deserve that. Life owes me. That's jealousy creeping in. And when we have those feelings, that should ding our conscience like, hey, something's not right. And the big alarm that should go off in your head is for jealousy is when you start to actually see somebody else succeed and feel happy, or like not succeed and feel happy about it. Like when other people like actually fail and you're like, yes, like that's a huge sign of jealousy. That you're like celebrating the failure of someone else. That's jealousy creeping in. And so these are kind of the four things that I think should really ding our conscience. And for the next few minutes, I just want to talk about ways we can prevent that, some preventative exercises. And for those of you in here that aren't Jesus followers yet, like this really isn't for you. These are things that Jesus tells us we should do. And if you can kind of, not have to do this if you don't want to. But I will tell you, if you do it, it's going to make your life better. Because when we follow Jesus, it always makes our life better. Whether you believe he is who he says he is yet or not, following him will make your life better. And that's why he said to us, follow me, right? And so as we look throughout the scriptures, these are some things that we are called to do to kind of counteract and take these exercises against these traps of the heart. And they're very counterintuitive. They go against everything that we really would probably want or like to do, but these are the things that we're called to do. And the first one is this: when we go to guilt and we have this feeling, I owe you, the thing we have to do is confess. We have to tell somebody. And for many of us, we were raised that we have to confess to God, and that's great and all, but God already knows. Like, he's not surprised when we confess to him. He already knows it. What the confession that brings healing is the confession when we actually go to the person that we've wronged or that wronged us, and we have that conversation. And some of you may not even be able to do that, but maybe just confessing to someone that you trust. To say, hey, I have this guilt and it's just been wrecking me, and just get it out there. And usually if you take that first step with someone else, you can finally get up the courage to go to the person that you really have the conflict with. It will be the first step towards resolution. But we have to confess. And here's the thing, for this is why it's a guardrail. Like when you do this and when you get this out in the open, like there's going to be some minimal damage, because that's the nature of a guardrail. It prevents from like catastrophic damage, but there will be some damage, right? When we get this out there. But the thing is that like when you keep that guilt inside, like those secrets will suck the life out of you. And you have to get it out into the light. And when you do that, there will be this weight you lifted on your shoulders. And don't get me wrong, like when you do this and you actually confess your guilt to someone, like there is going to be this element of chaos in your life for a little bit. But on the inside, there's going to be a peace like you've never known, because that weight is finally off of your shoulders and it's out of your heart. The next one is this. When it comes to anger and this feeling of you owe me, we have to forgive. You have to identify what it is that has been taken from you and cancel that debt. And for many of us, you say, well, I feel like I'm letting them off. And that's what you're doing. You're letting them off. But you're also letting someone else off. You're letting you off. And when you do this, you start to minimize the other damage that's going to happen, because, again, this feeling of letting go is so freeing, and you're going to stop wrecking all your other relationships if you can deal with this thing in the past that has derailed you. Sometimes you have to just verbalize it. Sometimes you just have to say it. Sometimes you have to go and speak it. And sometimes you don't even feel it yet until you actually say it. Sometimes you have to kind of behave your way through it and say, you know what, I forgive you. And there's something very freeing just about saying those words. But if we don't, we carry that hurt and we carry that pain and we carry that anger into future relationships. And more damage is created. Forgive. Greed. I owe me. The cure for that, or the exercise we have to do, is to give generously. Whatever that looks like in your circumstance, everybody has a different definition of generosity, I think, but we have to give. We have to give something maybe that's precious to you away. Have you ever done that? Like something that you really hold valuable? Just give it away. Maybe you sell it, give it to the poor. See a need that somebody has and just go meet it. Start giving to a nonprofit or to the church, or go serve at the mission tomorrow. Like there are things you can do to just give, because when you start to give, that is the counteractive behavior to greed. And when you do, you start to realize that, like, hey, there's a joy that comes with giving. And you start to trust in God for your provision, because He's already got it all. You don't have to keep hoarding everything, but actually give it away. And for some of us, we need to acknowledge in the problem in our real hearts isn't that we think that like life owes me, but that we think that God owes me. And life happens, and how we respond is ultimately what determines the direction of our lives. Many of us have been angry with God about a lot of different things that have happened, and as a result, we start to fail to see how He's working in other parts of our lives. Like, we aren't counting our many blessings because we're consumed by this one burden. And we have to get to this place so that we start to see these trials and these blessings and these things that God puts in our life as blessings too, because when we go through the valley, that's where our faith actually grows. And I think for all of us, we've seen people who've went through something really hard. Maybe they lost a child, or they're dealing with cancer, and we see their faith, and we're like, man, I want to be like that. But yet when it comes to us, we don't always do it. It's this feeling of just celebrating everything that God has given us. And that's kind of the counteractive behavior to jealousy, is to celebrate. Celebrate what He's given. Celebrate the success of others. Celebrate everything. Throw parties all the time, right? Like, celebrate that people that got the dream house. Go bake them cookies and put them on their front porch and say, I'm so happy for you. Even though maybe you're not really on that, but you're behaving your way past it, right? You're celebrating. Congratulate the guy that got the promotion that you should have got. Do those things. Celebrate, and don't let jealousy take hold of your life. And I think that's why in Philippians 4 it says this. It says, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. It's this getting to this place that no matter what life throws at you, no matter what curveball happens, no matter what the circumstance, how bad it seems, like, we celebrate what God is doing. It's in our response to the trial. Because when we do that, and we realize these things, that I love that it says, like, God is near. Like, He's near in every situation. He doesn't always feel like it, but He is. And when we are aware of that, and we're aware of how He's working, and we start to celebrate the things that He's doing, there is a peace that comes that only He can bring, that will guard our hearts. And many of us have felt this. Maybe we've been in the midst of a storm and we prayed for that peace. And I love that transcends all understanding. Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, you're sitting in this moment where everything's terrible, and you're like, why do I have peace right now? It's God. And He's guarding your heart in that situation, and not letting the bitterness and the anger and the guilt and the greed and all that stuff seep in that moment. Because you're choosing to put it all in His hands and to let Him carry those burdens and to trust Him. But we have to be aware of this, because oftentimes we're not. And I love what Andy Stanley, who wrote much of the material for this series and the content that we're doing, he said that when he was putting his kids to bed every night, he would always ask them this question. He would just say, is everything okay in your heart? It's a very simple question, but I don't think it's one that we ask very often. And I think it's one we should ask of ourselves. Is everything okay in your heart? Do you have any secrets? Are you mad at someone? Are you consumed with something somebody did or said to you? Are you having imaginary conversations with someone that you haven't had the nerve to actually have in person? Are you clinging to certain positions or obsessed with getting the next best thing? Are you celebrating someone's misfortune? Is everything okay in your heart? And I think for us as believers, we have to learn to monitor and behave it, because above all else, we have to guard our hearts. And for some of us, that means that maybe every morning or at night when we go and we brush our teeth, when we look at the mirror, we just ask that question of ourselves, is everything okay in our heart. And we take a stand and we say, I'm not going to let those things be the boss of me anymore. Those things are not going to come into my heart. They're not going to master us. We say, guilt, you're not going to consume me. I'm going to tell someone. I'm going to confess. I'm going to get it out of my heart. We say, anger, I'm not going to let that have a hold on me. I'm going to forgive that person that wronged me, and I'm going to go do it. And greed, you're not going to consume me. I'm going to give, and I'm going to give until I can't give anymore. And you say, it's jealousy, you're not going to be my master. I'm going to celebrate. I'm going to throw parties left and right and celebrate the successes of others. And when we do these things, we protect our hearts, because above all else, guard your heart. Everything you do flows from it. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for what it teaches us, God. I pray that today, just if there's something that is in our hearts, God, that you would convict us and you would help us to see it and not bury it down any further, but to get it out in a healthy way so that the damage is minimal to those around us and that it can be dealt with, and that no longer would we let it consume us or wreak havoc in our relationships, God, but just that you would be and give us what only you can do, which is the peace that transcends all understanding. And so we just pray that for each and every person in this room, for every person that's watching online right now, God, just that you would guard our hearts and that we would be aware of it and that we would do the hard work and do the things that don't make sense and that are counterintuitive to what we really feel, and to get out of our comfort zones. But ultimately, God, you would bring about healing in our hearts and in our lives and our relationships as a result. We pray these things in your name. Amen.